Good morning, Mercy View. My name is Jama Raubach. I'm a partner here at Mercy View, and I'm also a member of the Missions Committee, and I just want to ditto everything that Heather said, and please plan to join us on the 27th. Our scripture reading this morning is 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 through 5. And these verses can be found on page 140 of the Blue Bibles on the floor in front of you. If you do not have a Bible, please feel free to take this one with you. It's our gift to you. 1 Samuel 22, 1 through 5. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became commander over them. And there were with him about 400 men. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not remain in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning. Again, Mercy View, it's great once again to be bringing the word to you today. We're actually going to be not just in that section that Jama read for us. We have a pretty big section this morning of 1 Samuel, all of 21, and then that portion of 22. So leave your Bibles open there to 21 and that first part of chapter 22, but we're also going to be in Psalm 142 and 34 as well this morning. My name's Trey. I am the executive director here. I'm also an Elder Apprentice here at the church, and excited to get a chance to unpack this text with you. We're picking up where Brad left off last week in 1 Samuel 21. And as we do that, I want you to think about something with me. Have you ever been in a situation in life where the dominoes of life begin to stack up and they start to fall so rapidly that you barely have time to think, and you just kind of start making snap decisions, and a chain of bad decisions follows? This isn't one of those like life's dominoes start stacking situations, but maybe a word picture to help you understand what that looks like. Last March, I went to visit my family over spring break with my kids. They live on a farm in Arkansas, and March in South Arkansas is pretty wet. It's a really boggy place where our family farms at. And we were building some goat pens and using the tractor to do that. And it was so wet that as my dad was driving the tractor into the field, he actually ended up getting it stuck. Now, we wanted to get it out of the field, obviously. And so to get it out, we went and we started to try and give some traction to the back tires of the tractor. So we put some boards underneath it to try to help it get there. And as he would drive the tractor, which is a four-wheel drive piece of equipment, right? He would spin the tires, and because there was so much mud, every time he spun the tires, he would dig a little bit deeper. Eventually, we called a neighbor to come with his tractor, and we attached a chain to it and continued to try to pull the tractor out of the mud. And when we realized that if we continued going, we were going to get that tractor stuck as well, we had to let it go. We were in this situation where decision after decision that we made, because we were desperate to keep the tractor from staying stuck in the mud for the next month and a half, because that's how long it had to stay there until everything dried out, that we just kept making bad decisions. And every time that we would put the gas down on the tractor, that thing would bury deeper and deeper until eventually it was about 2.5 feet deep into the mud in the field. That is the situation David finds himself in as we get into chapter 21 of 1 Samuel. If you remember last week, we saw how Jonathan warns David that it's not safe for him to stay in Gibeah. He can't come back to Saul's palace. He needs to flee for his own safety. And our text this morning picks up where we left David, and he is on the run. literally running for his life. He's in trouble, he's tired, he's hungry, and we're going to see that he's going to start making some really poor and honestly some really sinful decisions throughout this chapter. What I really want us to see first this morning is the first of a threefold bit of this text, and that is that the fear of man often leads to sinful folly. Now, what should be apparent in our story is that David has every right to be afraid. His life is actually in danger. At the very least, he's had 2 spears hurled at him while he's playing his harp in the palace. I would be a little upset and a little scared, right? This is his 3rd flight to safety in the span of just a few days, maybe a couple of weeks. We know that he had to leave his house in the middle of the night, and he flees to Samuel. He gets to Samuel. We don't know how long he's there with Samuel and Naoth, but he's there for a little bit of time, and then Saul sends multiple assassins to come and kill him, and finally comes himself, and God miraculously rescues him, and he has to flee from there, and he's just sleeping out in the cover of a field for at least 3 days as Jonathan tries to find out if there's any way that he can return to the palace, return to his adopted family. Like, he's come into this family. He's the king's son-in-law. And now, the text doesn't really give us any internal motivation for why he's doing this, but David, he makes for the city of Nob. This is where the tabernacle is set up. And we know that this is the 2nd time that David has fled toward the safe haven of one of God's stewards of right worship in the land of Israel. And on the surface, it seems that David is running toward the safety of God's presence, though the Ark of the Covenant's not there. This is where worship is centered at. The tabernacle is where God's worship is being done, and the Ark's not there. It's still sitting in the threshing floor of the place where it landed when the Philistines sent it back from Dagon's temple. But this is the seat of worship, and he's going toward God's presence. And whatever was happening in his mind and in his heart when he set out toward the tabernacle, small details in the text in 1 Samuel 21 begin to let us know that David quickly comes to the conclusion that this place isn't going to be safe for him either. The first sign is when he gets there in chapter 21, verse 1, Ahimelech the priest, who's actually from the line of Eli, he comes out to meet David. And when David sees him, Ahimelech is trembling. He's clearly frightened by the sight of David. And we're not told what Ahimelech knows, but it would be fairly obvious that if it's not from the king's own lips, rumors have already spread to the tabernacle at Nob that David has fallen out of favor with Saul. And to make matters worse, we're told in verse 7 that Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen, was there that day. And David would have likely known, or at least known of, Doeg. And as we'll see in a later part of chapter 22, David would have been well aware of the lack of character that this man possessed. And so with a quiver in his voice and a tremor in his hands, Ahimelech the priest asked David, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" And I think it's at this moment that David has a choice to make. He can let the full truth be known to the priest, that he's being unjustly pursued by the king who is now acting wickedly, and he's making his escape. Or he can tell a lie. And I wrestle with whether or not to call what David does here that, a lie. Because as we saw in the last couple of weeks, there seems to be this tension in the text in 1 Samuel between a kind of righteous deception and breaking the command against bearing false witness. There's this kind of concealment that can happen that preserves life righteously and the life of the righteous, and there's a kind that dishonors the Lord. So let's read the exchange that happens here starting in verse 2 together. And look at what happens in David's life. David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, 'Let no one know of anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you.' I had made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now, I've read several commentators this week trying to decide what is happening with David in this instance. And what I found from the several that I read is about half of them think that David is sinning here, that he's telling a lie. The other half see this kind of righteous concealment to preserve Ahimelech's own life. David doesn't want Ahimelech to be killed for aiding and abetting someone who's committed, quote unquote, treason. They see him acting with this kind of righteous concealment in this moment. And those who would say that David is acting righteously here would argue a couple of things. One, it's possible that when David says, "The king has charged me with a matter that required secrecy," he was in his heart referring to Yahweh. Elsewhere, David does refer to God as king after all, and so he could have been doing that here. Kind of sounds like some of the excuses I hear my kids make from time to time when they want to get out of being in trouble. But he could have been doing that. Second, David's motive is to protect Ahimelech from Saul. David, we will find out next week rightly, fears that if Ahimelech renders aid to a known fugitive, Saul will take his anger out on him. And so they argue that David is seeking to preserve the life of an innocent man. And these, in particular the second, are plausible reasons for David to be working in a kind of righteous deception. However, I'm less convinced that David's motives are quite so noble. In fact, I'm not sure David's actions are tied to any real clear motive at all. Rather, he's just in this state of poor, snap decision-making that often comes from fear. Particularly when we're fatigued, the body's fight-or-flight response takes over when we encounter something that makes us afraid. And David coming into the tabernacle and seeing Ahimelech trembling with fear, seeing the wicked man Doeg over by the altar, would have frightened him to death. And what we've learned through modern science is that when we perceive a threat, the amygdala, the part of our brain that controls our fight or flight response and our fear and emotional response to things, sends this emergency signal to the body, and it releases stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. And this reaction bypasses the rational thinking part of the brain and prioritizes immediate action over logical reasoning. And for David, often for us as well, these aren't just moments when we need logic and reason, and we do need those in moments of fear. But these are moments where what's required is faith. See, sin thrives in the heart of a fearful man. It'll often take advantage of even the most righteous of men when it grips their hearts. And David is afraid, so he lies. In this moment of deception, this lie that he tells begins a chain reaction that will end with David not only being alone and on the run, but utterly humiliated and at the lowest moment in his life. Yet David's first reaction after fleeing Jonathan is to run to the tabernacle. Maybe he runs there just because he knows that there might be food available. In verse 3, he's going to ask for bread. Maybe he knows that Goliath's sword is still there. Maybe he's the one who actually deposited it at the tabernacle as a gift after slaying the giant. But given what we know about David, it's more likely that he's going here because he knows that the presence of God is where he should flee. He knows, just like he showed when he went to Samuel, that his hope and refuge is in the Lord. And for a moment, as Jonathan leaves and he has to begin making his run, he runs to the place where he knows God's presence will be found. And he stops short. He may trust in the God of Israel, but he doesn't seem to trust Ahimelech. He definitely doesn't trust Doeg. And instead of continuing to trust in the Lord, in spite of all of that, the fear of these men and of Saul stops him in his tracks. he decides then and there that refuge can't be found here at the tabernacle. He has to look elsewhere. And what happens in the rest of the encounter shows us that David's lack of faith is misplaced. And so he comes and he tells this story to Ahimelech, and he asks for bread. And the only bread that's available is the show bread. This hot bread that was set out once a week at the beginning of the week as an offering to the Lord and reserved once it was replaced with new and fresh bread for the priest. It was holy bread that could only be eaten by them. It wasn't meant for the common people or for common use. An interesting note that I found in the commentary was that the lack of any other food at the tabernacle actually shows the state of Israel at this time. Had the people of God been faithful in their worship, there would have been a bounty of food available to supply David and his men. The tithe in the Old Testament wasn't of coin, but of crops and of herds. And this was the way that God provided for the tribe of Levi. This was how he satisfied their hunger. Without giving them lands of their own, he gave them a portion of what the people would bring. We see after a brief exchange and satisfied that David is holy and not profaned, Ahimelech gives him bread, he gives him Goliath's sword, and then David makes his next move. And his next move is one of those that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It says, David rose in verse 10 and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Now, in case you don't remember, Gath is a Philistine city. It's not just a Philistine city. It is the home of Goliath. David is famous in his own day for having slain Goliath and tens of thousands of Philistines. And for whatever reason, he thinks to himself, after leaving the tabernacle, you know where I should go? The enemy of my enemy. Maybe they'll be my friend. And so for whatever reason, with Goliath's own sword strapped to his hip, David heads for that city. It's about as brash as you can get and as foolish as you can get. It's almost like the story of Hector in the Trojan War and the Battle of Achilles in the Iliad. It's the singular event that turns the tide in favor of the Greeks because Achilles has been sulking by the ships, unwilling to come into the battle. But his friend Patroclus wears Achilles' armor into the field, and he dies, slain at Hector's hand. And Hector takes Achilles' armor as his own. And then Achilles gets up and comes to face Hector on the battlefield. And he's angry, and he slays him because he sees the kind of just perverseness of taking what wasn't his own, and he takes his life. Hector comes out to face Achilles wearing Achilles' own armor, and it ends really bad for Hector, and it's trending that way for David when he gets to Gath. Look with me here in chapter 21. It says, the servants of Achish said to him, is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And David sees what's happening as he's drugged before Achish. In the title of Psalm 56, there's a note that says, when the Philistines seized him at Gath, they grab David and they drag him before Achish's court. And so again, he's faced with a fight or flight moment. And here, David doesn't lie. Not exactly. No, here he humiliates himself. In verse 13, we read that he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands. He made marks on the doors of the gate, and he let the spittle run down his beard. And Achish says, do I need any more crazy men around me? Get this man from my sight. It's likely that pretending to be insane saved David's life. But I want you to see here the trajectory that fear and deception has led David down. A quick lie in the presence of Ahimelech has now led him to a moment where the only perceived way of escape is to act like a madman. And I'm sure that part of David felt like a madman in this moment. And he finds a way out of the situation. And we don't get the details of how he gets out. In verse 1 of chapter 22, we see that he escaped from there to the cave of Adullam. Before we move on to the second thing I want us to see this morning, I want to pause and take in this whole story. And I want us to notice something. The fear of man leads to poor decision-making at best and sinful folly at worst. This isn't the first time in 1 Samuel that we've seen the fear of man be an issue. Actually, it's been a recurring theme throughout the book. It's the plumb line of sin in this book. Eli's worthless sons are running roughshod over the people, and Eli himself, though he rebukes them, he does it half-heartedly. He's apathetic, and his response comes from an inability to endure their displeasure and what would require his own humble admission of failure to train them up. And so, afraid of what that means for him, he just ignores it and gets fat off of their wickedness. When we get over to the people's request for a king in chapter 8, it's a similar fear of man, namely the rising tide of the Ammonites, raiding parties that are coming into their homes in chapter 11, that leads the people to cry out in chapter 8 for a king. They need a champion, like all the other nations around them. And that very champion, who in his own fear of man moments has made rash vows, disobeyed the Lord on multiple occasions, and now seeks to destroy his faithful servant David, we see that the fear of man clearly leads to places that we don't want to go. Yet like Eli, Israel, Saul, and now David, we find ourselves here in this place of fearing man more than fearing God time and time again. And so how does that fear of man present itself for you? Well, maybe for the last couple of weeks, you've heard Brad draw out the way that jealousy and anger festers in our hearts, and it breeds bitterness and resentment for those in your family, your church, or the other spheres of life. And you've felt the sting of conviction, but you stop short of actually dealing with it. Like, what happens when I admit to them that this is there under the surface? Like, what if I've done what the Proverbs tell me not to do? Like the thing that makes me a fool, and I've given full vent to my frustrations with another friend, and now confronting my bitterness, it causes me to lose face with not only the person that I'm bitter toward, but now I got to confess to the friend that I've vented my frustrations with. What if they didn't know that I was frustrated and that I was bitter, and now I've made things awkward? And so we fail to confront sin. The fear of man comes out when we shrink back from confronting the sin in a brother or sister's life because we know that the conversation is going to be hard. There's another way you might not expect that the fear of man begins to take hold in our hearts. So when we refuse to move from relational evangelism with an unbelieving friend that we've known for half a decade or more, because what if telling them that without trusting in Christ for the forgiveness of their sins, that means they won't be my friend anymore? Then I'll never see them come to know the Lord. It's better just to stay quiet, be ready in season and out of season to give a defense when their world crumbles and then they really need Jesus. See, when we begin to recognize the way that the fear of man drives us toward sin, toward foolish decision-making, cowardice, and the like, we have a choice to make. Will we be unyielding in our stubbornness and fear like Eli, like Israel, like Saul? Or will we be like David? Will we find our refuge in the Lord? David and Saul, in many ways, are not so different, at least not at this point in David's story. The differences are there, but they begin to stack up in this season of Exodus that David is in. These wilderness wanderings that he's going through. He was afraid that Ahimelech would not keep him safe, that Doeg would run to Saul and out his plans, and that Achish would listen to the voice of his people and end David's life. And so David's lied, he's deceived, he's utterly debased himself into isolation. And in 22:1, we read that David departed from Gath, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. This is about 10 miles to the east of Gath in the territory of Judah. It's not far from Bethlehem. And there's this network of caves that exist on the outskirts of this little town of Adullam. And it's likely that David knew this area pretty well. He might have pastured his flocks in the vicinity. Maybe the lions and the bears that he talks about fighting and fending off the sheep from in chapter 17 came from these very caves. But we know that when he arrives, he's all alone. We don't know for how long. But at least a moment, he is on his own in the hills and the caves. And my mind's eye, impacted as it is by watching lots of dramatized movies in Hollywood, it pictures this ragged, breathless David arriving to the mouth of a cave in the pouring rain. He sneaks into the dark, damp hideout. He pulls out the last loaf of showbread from his pack and weeps as he cries out to the Lord. And whatever if that's my imagination and whatever ends up being close to the actual picture, one thing's for certain. Alone in the caves of Adullam, David cries out to the Lord in desperation. We know that he did, because he wrote at least 2 songs from the caves. It's noted in the Psalms themselves. One of those is Psalm 142, and for my money, I think 143 is part of this. But listen to David's prayer in Psalm 142. He says, "With my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. When my spirit faints within me, you know my way. In the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see, there is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains for me. No one cares for my soul. I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison, that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you deal bountifully with me." Here in the caves by himself, David does what he should have done from the beginning. He runs to the Lord for refuge. There is nowhere else that he can go. The only other option he has is to double down on his own wisdom and strength, his own plans, but those haven't worked out. Samuel couldn't save him. Jonathan's pleas for mercy from Saul fall on deaf ears. Ahimelech was a coward, and the Philistines are literally his enemies. One plan after another, and providence has frustrated every single one. David is at the same crossroads that Saul faced on the mountain in chapter 13. This is David's unlawful sacrifice moment where he can trust that God is going to work all things according to David's good and God's glory, where he can continue to trust in his own strength. And it's in this moment, and the others like it, that we begin to see how David is the man after God's own heart. He's not like the kings of all the other nations. The contrast between David and Saul in this moment could not be any more stark. Right here, right now, we see the king that David will be. When faced with impossible circumstances, the odds stacked against him, David's only hope for refuge is in the Lord. On the run from the king, he finally understands that the only place to truly run is to the King of Kings. His prayer in Psalm 142 is a window into what is happening in his heart. In verse 5, I would argue this is the turning point in David's entire life. He says, I cry to you, O Lord, you are my refuge. You are my portion in the land of the living. This is the hinge point in the entire sermon this morning. If you get nothing else from what I say, get this. The righteous take refuge in the Lord. The wise receive their portion from the cup of the Lord. The wicked take their own strength. The fool, as Proverbs reminds us, takes his portion of stolen bread from Lady Folly. We could play a quick counterfactual with David. What if he had trusted that God's priest at Nob would be faithful to the Lord? That they would provide safe haven? What if his initial impulse to seek refuge in the presence of the Lord was right and he should have done that all along? We can see where God does indeed work all things according to the good of this future king that he is called. But honestly, we don't need to know what would have happened if it didn't take him reaching rock bottom to get there. David's story is already written and before us. And because of that, what you can learn is what happens when you take refuge in the Lord. That's not like things are going to start getting better right away. And they didn't for David. It's not as if he sings Psalm 142 and angels appear with food and water and sweet words of comfort. There's still another psalm that he writes in the cave, Psalm 143. He says, hear my prayer, O Lord. Give ears to my pleas for mercy. In your faithfulness, answer me in your righteousness. Enter not into judgment with your servant, for no one living is righteous before you. David's acknowledging his sin as he's made his way to this low moment. For the enemy has pursued my soul. He has crushed my life to the ground. He has made me sit in darkness like those long dead. Therefore my spirit faints within me. My heart within me is appalled. I remember the days of old. I meditate on all that you have done. I ponder the work of your hands. I stretch out my hands to you. My soul thirsts for you like a parched land. He goes on. It doesn't get better. He still needs rescue. He still needs to face his trials and his sins and his fears head on. Yet, he's finding refuge in the Lord. Meaning, he is trusting that the outcome of his circumstances are in the sovereign hand of God. He is resting in providence. In his lowest moment, his faith is being strengthened as he turns to the Lord. And so returning to our example earlier about the fear of man. Let's say you finally decide that instead of ignoring conversations of faith with your unbelieving friends, you're going to actually share the gospel with them. Taking refuge in the fact that the Lord is knowing that it doesn't matter how well you speak or how hard their heart might be, the Lord is the one who softens the heart and makes the speech sweet as honey from the honeycomb. He's the one who does it. You've been friends for a decade. Tell them about Jesus. There's more going on in David's life than the fear of man, though. Maybe it's some of what's going on in your life right now, too. Sure, you can't relate to being trapped in a cave on the run from a murderous father-in-law, at least I hope not. But as we walk through the story of David's escape, you could feel in your own soul his anxiety for him. Like you know fear and dread because you feel it for yourself for any number of reasons every day. So how do you take refuge in the Lord when the fear turns to anxiety and this constant onslaught of the two, they drive you into a woeful melancholy? You can sing the songs that David sang. Sing Psalm 142 and Psalm 143. And sit in the lack of resolution and intermingled hope that it has. Sing Psalm 56. It's another song he wrote, the song that he wrote when he was seized in Gath. He says, "You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle, and are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me, in God whose word I praise. In the Lord whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me?" Friends, the righteous take refuge in the Lord. And then look at this. This is the last thing I want you to see this morning. The Lord blesses those who take refuge in him. The portion of the text that we read together this morning was in chapter 22, 1 through 5. David, he's in the cave. And starting in the second part of verse 1, we read, "And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became commander over them. There were about 400 men." Again, we aren't given the specifics of how long it took for this to happen, but eventually, word got out that David was in these caves. And maybe he indeed had some of the men who followed him set to rendezvous with him there. Maybe that wasn't just the lie that he told Ahimelech. Maybe he had to sneak into town and grab more food when he ran out of the showbread. But eventually, word gets back to his brothers and his father's house, and they desert King Saul, and they gather to him. Soon, his secret hideout is less than a secret. And everyone who is distressed, and everyone who is in debt, and everyone who is bitter in soul gathers to David. And there are a couple ways, I think both end up being accurate pictures of what's happening here, of reading this situation. First, if you remember back to the Lord's warning to his people when they demanded a king in 1 Samuel 8:11, the Lord warned them if they got a king the way that they were asking for a king, they would get what they wanted. He would be a king like all the nations. God said he'll take your sons and appoint them to his chariots. He'll appoint them for himself commanders of thousands, commanders of 50, and some to plow his ground and some to reap his harvest. Some to make implements of war and equipment for his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and your vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He'll take a tenth of your grain and your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He'll take your male servants and female servants, the best of your young men and donkeys, and put them to his work. He'll take a tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out to because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. No. The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. So David has been anointed king. God does hear them, but this is the point that they're at in the story. Part of what's happening in this moment with David is the fruit of what Israel has sowed when they demanded Saul. As he has descended deeper and deeper into wickedness, he has become the kind of king that God warned his people a king after their own heart would be. And so now, 30 or so years later, they and their children and grandchildren are reaping the consequences. You have this growing cohort of people who are distressed and indebted, and they're bitter. And then to see the champion of Israel, the one who has slain his tens of thousands, experiencing the same unjust oppression at the hand of the very man responsible for their own suffering, they run to him. I think another part of what's happening here, though, is typological. In that this is pointing to not just David, but to the son of David. The one who had nowhere to lay his head so that he could rest, yet called out to his people, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." You see, David is giving his people, without even knowing it, a taste of the future kingdom, a glimpse at the future king, the true king. And we can see it in another psalm that he wrote while he was on the run. In the title of Psalm 34, we see that David started writing that song at his lowest moment, when he had changed his appearance before Ahimelech, or Abimelech, another name for Achish. My guess is that the song started then, but it gets filled out as he starts to see all the people coming to him at the cave. As his heart has found refuge in the Lord, he sees the people bitter, tired, heavy laden with an oppressive yoke. And I think he teaches them this psalm. We hear a portion of it every week. But listen to what he says, starting in verse 1 of Psalm 34. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble, another way to translate that is the poor and afflicted, hear and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. David has every reason to be bitter and angry, just like all the people coming to him. But he has found his refuge in the Lord. And he teaches this throng that is gathered around him to not look to him, but to look to the Lord. He says, I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all of his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. David sees what is happening. He remembers the cry of his heart in Psalm 142 and 143, how desperate he felt, and now he sees that the Lord hasn't forsaken him. He hasn't left him. He isn't even letting him stay alone. He's blessing him beyond anything that he could have imagined. He looks back to see the way that God rescued him from Saul at his home, with Samuel at Naioth, at Nob, and at Gath, and knows that the only explanation is that the angel of the Lord has encamped about him. And so then in verse 8, he says, and you hear this every single week here at Mercy View, so taste and see the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Oh, fear the Lord, you his saints. For those who fear him have no lack. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. We could go on and see in verse 13 that he acknowledges his sin. Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit, because the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous and his ears toward their cry. David is righteous in that he's falsely accused of treason. He's being pursued under false pretense and recognizes that he didn't have to take matters into his own hand. Instead, he could just run to the Lord. So here's the last point this morning. Here's the thing I want you to take away today. The Lord blesses those who find their refuge in him. There's blessing for those who find their hope and their rest and their refuge from all of the things in life that assail us in the Lord. First and foremost, the blessing the Lord offers to us is when we find our refuge in him, we receive the promise of Matthew 10 that Jesus spoke. He will give you rest. It's the promise of Romans 8:28 that we sung about earlier, that for God's elect, he works all things for our good and for his glory. Friends, you don't have to fear man today. And you don't have to carry the weight of your anxiety. You don't have to bear the burden of your sin. You can bring all of it, your distress, your debts, your bitterness of soul, and lay it at the feet of Jesus. You can, like David, come this morning, and you can taste and see that the Lord is good. He hears the cry of his people. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Friends, he calls you saints, righteous, and the righteous fear the Lord, and they have no lack. It's not that your problems go away. David is going to be on the run for nearly 10 years. You might still have that friend that you need to confess your bitterness to, and they reject you. They reject your confession. You may share the gospel with winsome hope and still have it rejected. You may still have bouts of fear and anxiety and depression, but in every season, in every moment, the Lord is there as your refuge. Cry to him. He will hear it, and he will answer from heaven. Come to him with your heavy laden burdens and your labor, and take his yoke upon you. Find rest for your weary soul. Let's pray this morning.